Welcome to this new virtual series, A Walk in the Park with Gil. My name is Gil Penalosa, in Spanish, Guillermo Peñalosa. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, and lived during my childhood across from a public park. My parents say that actually I lived in the park. Many years later, I served as Bogota's head of parks, sports and recreation. Magnificent opportunity. I led the design and construction of over 200 parks, from Simón Bolívar Park with over 100 hectares to multiple neighborhood ones, mostly in low-income areas. Now I live in Canada, and 15 years ago created 880 Cities, a non-profit organization which focuses on parks, streets, and other public spaces and their uses by people of all ages and backgrounds. I was elected chair of World Urban Parks twice and now serve as its ambassador. Chris, thank you very much for having accepted to do this session. We are very eager to learn about this project that is going to be good for people and nature and the city.
Hello, everyone. Buenos dias. Thank you for inviting me, Gil. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to have this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen and take you for a walk through a park that is not yet built. So I'm going to talk today about a park that doesn't exist yet, but is under construction as part of our complete reconstruction of the mouth of one of the two major rivers that frame the city of Toronto. And I want to start by giving you just a quick history. This is actually the original map that Lord Simcoe drew up to send to King George of the city of Toronto. And you can see there's the original 10 square blocks there, nestled between two creeks. And near that is the Don River. And the Don River emptied into a huge marsh called the Ashbridges Bay Marsh, which was the largest freshwater marsh in the Great Lakes system. Over the years, the city filled in the water, hardened the dock wall edge. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the Don River is starting to be put into a channel to create more land for industrial uses and urban growth. And then by about 1911, early 20th century, the Ashbridges Bay Marsh, has been completely filled in with future industrial sites. The river is now in something called the Keating Channel. And on the right-hand side, you see a notional idea about a park system that was never realized as part of the landfill and industrialization. So we got the industrial sites, but we didn't get the promised parks. And that has been a theme of this waterfront really for almost the last 100 years until Waterfront Toronto came along. The effect of that river project was to take the entire Don River watershed, which is about 40,000 acres, and all of the rain, all of the stormwater runoff is channeled down into that tiny little slot that you see in the yellow box down there, which, as you can imagine, created some flooding problems. Now, this isn't the other river in Toronto, the Humber River. When we had a hurricane, which is very unusual for Toronto, we don't tend to get hurricanes this far inland, but this hurricane basically wiped out every house and structure that had been built in the Humber River Valley in 1954 and gave the city 5,000 acres of River Valley parkland back. And redevelopment was prohibited after that storm. That led the regulators to realize that the Don River, like the Humber River, could experience that same level of hurricane rainfall. And so by the 1980s, legislation had been put in place designating the whole area around the lower part of the Don River as flood area. So these two blue zones are what were called the two spill zones. And you can see spill zone 1 goes quite far to the left. It comes all the way over, in fact, to our central business district. And everything in that blue zone from about 1980 onwards was not allowed to be redeveloped. So it froze all of that land. And the same has been true for spill zone 2. So this actually presented a huge barrier to our waterfront revitalization. Many cities have these former industrial waterfronts, but ours couldn't really be redeveloped without flood protection. And the scale of the flood protection project was quite large. And it led to the creation of the organization I work for, which is Waterfront Toronto. We're a unique public corporation in Canada because we are equally owned by all three levels of government. So the federal government of Canada, provincial government of Ontario, and the municipal government of Toronto each have three shareholders. And in these photos, you see the three leaders of those political bodies who each committed money to our efforts. So in the upper left, you see former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, former Provincial Premier Mike Harris, and former Mayor Lastman. One of the only times those three people ever were together because they all did not tend to get along. And then in the lower right, fast forward about 17 years, and you see in the middle our current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. To the left is our current Mayor John Tory, and to the right our former Premier Kathleen Wynne, pledging another 1.25 billion, which has all gone to waterfront revitalization. That second batch of funding, the 1.25 billion, was exclusively for the flood protection and infrastructure project and naturalization of the river that I'm going to show you today. So we actually started the flood protection work quite some time ago, and we decided to tackle each of these two spill zones separately. So spill zone 1 is the one we did first, and you can see in orange there a band that is what we call the flood protection landform. You might call it a dike or a levee, different terms for it, but the idea is that when the floodwaters rise, that levee is high enough that they never flow over the top of it and spill into the downtown. So we flood protected the west side of the Don River, and that enabled us to redevelop this whole former industrial precinct that we call the West Donlands Precinct. It was quite vacant, as you can see here. It had been assembled by the city in the 1980s. They were going to revitalize it, but they realized the flood protection project was too enormous for their capital budget. So they gave the land to the province, and the province was never able to come up with all the money to do the flood protection either. So it sat like this for about 20 years. And then when Waterfront Toronto got started, this was one of the first precincts we did. We brought in the urban planning firm of Urban Design Associates from Pittsburgh to do a master plan that would blend the flood protection, a park system, and urban revitalization all together into a new neighborhood. And here you see the original plan for it. And then here you see a diagram of what it started to look like as the public realm designs came along and some of the buildings started to be designed. So the flood protection sits in the very bottom there and is integrated with an urban park that we call Corktown Common. And here is Corktown Common and the flood protection under construction, and a huge stormwater retention pond during construction, and the site cleared. You can see towards the bottom, the park pavilion, right next to the words Don River Park. Just to the left, you see a kind of wing-shaped roof. That's our park pavilion in Corktown Common. This drawing shows it a little bit better. Here you see the sort of formalized park that has several different programmatic components. It has a central lawn, which is at the terminus of the view down Front Street, which is the main street you see there in the middle that goes straight back to the very center of Toronto. And to the left, we have a pretty robust children's playground. The pavilion has washrooms for parents and kids. There's a sledding hill and slides and sand pits and all of those things. To the right, there's actually a recreation of the kind of marsh habitat that would have existed here when the Don River flowed through here before it was put in the channel. That marsh is actually the stormwater treatment facility for the park. So all the stormwater that runs off the pathways and lawns is collected up, goes into that marsh. The sediment is able to settle out. The water's clean enough that we now have quite a bit of habitat in there. We've got bullfrogs and dragonflies and ducks all making nests and living there. So it's a moment of the original nature of the Don River brought back right up against the city. So you see that big dark building, that was one of the first residential buildings. presence of the park increased the land value. They sold those units for more than they had expected to because these residents had this fantastic park asset right across the street. And then below the marsh, you see the Aspen Grove, which actually you feel like you're in the woods when you walk through there. So in a way, it's almost a miniature Central Park with several different kinds of landscapes and typologies. And it's only about 8 acres where the formal park is, but it feels much bigger. And then if you look to the bottom, you see flood protection landform, dry side. So that's where the park is, which is on the top of that line. On the bottom of that big white arcing line is what we call the wet side of the berm. So the floodwaters can come up all the way to that dashed line in the modeling without flooding moving into the city. And that lower area has to be maintained just as a meadow, because if there is that kind of storm surge, the water needs to be able to move through here quickly, and trees and shrubs create friction and would actually increase the flood volumes. So that is mowed on a regular basis and is really just maintained as a very simple meadow, but it could not have been really developed as park. I'm going to just mention the amount of innovation that went into this. When we first did the design for the berm, the engineers wanted both sides of the berm to look like the wet side. They said you can't have trees, you can't have furniture, you can't have pavilions, because the berm, its structural integrity can't be compromised with tree roots and building foundations. And so the design firm that did the park, Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates, who are, I think, best known these days for having done Brooklyn Bridge Park, their idea was just to put more soil on top. So they put another 2 to 3 meters of soil on top of the flood protection landform, created even more topography, and that gave them the soil depth they needed for trees and building foundations, and enabled us to deliver a real parkscape and not just a giant lawn. So I think it's an important lesson in making sure that all these different disciplines are integrated, because when you try to solve these problems in isolation, you don't get very exciting results. And had this all just been one big grassy meadow, it would not be the exciting destination that it is. I'm not sure it would have increased the value of the development land around it, and it certainly wouldn't have been much of a resource to the community. Here's another view of that marshland that I was talking about. This is still early days. These trees have grown in substantially since this aerial was taken. And here's a somewhat later photo of the marsh. And you can see how you just feel like you're in nature. You don't even have a sense of the city, but just to the right is a big condominium building. And then here is the one of the play areas with the splash pad and the pavilion. So I'm going to move now to the second phase of flood protection, which is in an area we call the lower Donlands, and that is the spill zone 2. You see the word Portlands. That whole area is what used to be that freshwater marsh I mentioned at the beginning that was filled in to create the industrial port, which never really materialized. And the plan here is to actually redirect the river where you see that squiggly dark blue line. And the reason we're doing that is in order to flood protect, there needs to be more outlet space for the river. And the original idea was to widen the existing Keating channel. So if I just go back, if you see the river comes down from the top of the picture and then takes a hard right turn and runs through that Keating channel. The original proposal was to widen that and to naturalize the river mouth. There's been a 40-year-long effort to naturalize the river, to take it out of the concrete channel that it's in and create some habitat. And if you can't necessarily see it so clearly here, but had it been widened and naturalized there, it would have been right underneath our elevated expressway, which I don't think would have made for the greatest natural environment with all these concrete columns holding up a highway above. It also would not have really enabled that river project to catalyze new development. So one of the early projects I did when I started here was I said, let's do a design competition and let's really treat the river as an asset and as the center of a community. So we set out 2 goals for this design competition, which by the way was not just design in the landscape sense, but we called for multidisciplinary teams. So each of the competing teams had about 15 to 20 different disciplines on it: civil engineering, hydrology, ecology, urban planning, everything. And the idea was to create an identity for the Don River that both flood protected and restored the habitat. And the second goal was that that concept had to integrate new development, transportation infrastructure, parks, and the river mouth into one sort of strong, harmonious piece of urban fabric. So it was an unusual design competition in that it had to deal with multiple parameters, but it had to find a way to synthesize them because until that time, this had been moving along as again, very much of an engineering study only as to how to manage all the flooding. And then with an idea that we would just have some soft riverbanks and we'd bring some ecologists in later and they would plant some native plants and we would have achieved the goal, which I don't think would have really been very powerful. So the competition yielded this whole new idea that no one had thought of, which was rather than taking what's listed as number 2 here, which is the Keating Channel, and naturalizing that, the idea was to actually move the entire mouth of the river about half a kilometer south and cut it through vacant industrial land where there was enough space to create not only wetlands, but also a true park system on either side. And then add a third river outlet, number 3 there, called the Don Greenway, so that number 1 became the primary channel where most of the water will flow under normal conditions. And then 2 and 3 are essentially pressure relief valves for when the storms happen and there's too much water for the main channel. What we wanted to do is establish habitat there that wouldn't be completely destroyed every time there was a big storm. So we're using those 2 hard edge channels, the Keating Channel on the left and the Ship Channel on the right, to handle storm surge. And we're talking 100-year plus storm events, not annual. And then use the main channel the rest of the time for the typical flows, which aren't all that high in the Don River. And so the result was this winning scheme, which proposed a whole new precinct. And in the process, it also proposed a whole new island. So you see the Keating Channel there on the top was the end of the river. Since we carved it south and then west to create the new river mouth, we ended up with an additional island in our harbor. Now, the outer part of our harbor is defined by islands, and it's an island park system, and it's quite loved and quite well used by the whole city. This area has been kind of not on anyone's map of the city at all. But this project really is starting to put it there, and people are starting to take notice. And this will be, I think, the single biggest new piece of park infrastructure built in the downtown in probably the last 50 or 75 years. So here's an aerial view, and you see the river with the wetlands on either side, and then the upland park system. And I'm just going to walk you through the components. So the river valley itself, its shape was drawn upon from examples nearby. So the Rouge River, which has never been messed with, has the natural meander and a natural levee system and connected wetlands, and that's exactly what we've built here. We have a channel meander, we have levees, and lake-connected wetlands. And here you see some photos of what those different typologies look like, all drawn from the local area. And some renderings of what the landscape will look like when it's done. We have a lot of habitat ambitions here. We hope to see turtles. My personal hope is to get great blue herons here. Not easy to attract in an urban area, but it might happen. And then here's how the levee system works. So you have open water to the right, then you have emergent marsh habitat. So that's one whole set of plant species that will thrive in that kind of, what would be an intertidal zone on an ocean shore. Here it's a river, so it's really emergent marsh is what we call it, with a pathway right through all of the nature. Then the submergent marsh, where the water levels will not be too deep, plants can grow. Then we have a little farther upland, a couple of other typologies, including the meadow marsh, which is still close to the water, but not really in it. Thicket swamp, forest floodplain, and an upland forest. So we've really tried to fine tune the habitat here to create the different ecologies that you would find along one of these rivers in its original state. My slide doesn't want to change now. Come on, there we go. And this is a cross section that just shows you there were a lot of subsurface conditions that we had to wrestle with. This is very much engineering being used in the service of nature, rather than trying to actually engineer nature in an engineered way. It's still using some of the best sort of ideas and techniques of engineering to support a really naturalized environment. And these are more examples of all of the types of typologies and the target species that we wanted to provide support for. So these landscapes are quite fine-tuned to try to provide the places that each of these types of animals and fish like to inhabit. And then there'll be some more obvious constructed habitat, bird boxes. We're doing a lot of anchored wood. You see that on the upper right. Those are actually held down with cables and weights so they don't float away. And that's a very popular habitat type for lots of species. And even the stream bed under the river is being carefully designed with the right size stones, the right shape stones for fish habitat. Now we'll talk about the parks. So the parks themselves, we have a range of program from the kind of, all of this is a bit more urban now. This is more formal park, less wetland area. So we've got everything from dog off leash areas and picnic areas, you know, to canoe and kayak access, overlooks for bird watching, and they're distributed throughout the park. So some of the elements we're incorporating are going to be fire pits where people can have a fire. We have a indigenous population here that uses the fire circle for ceremonies, so we hope it will provide that function as well. A large event lawn where we could do you know, movies in the park or music in the park. And this event lawn is actually in Brooklyn Bridge Park, which our landscape architect designed. We know there are a couple of organizations that do nature camps for kids that are interested in running their camps here. In the middle is something that we call Destination Play. If any of you have been to Maggie Daley Park in Chicago, it's a totally immersive play environment over multiple acres that really gets kids being active and is a sort of compelling enough playscape that it gets kids off their screens. Maggie Daley attracts people from all over the greater Chicago area, and there's thousands of kids here every day. It's fantastic. If you have a chance to see it when you're in Chicago next, it's worth the trip. You know, picnic areas, cross-country skiing, and other typical park events. And then we've paid a lot of attention to water. So we're creating 4 canoe kayak launches, and a couple of them have an upland beach. So a group like you see in this upper left photo here could actually assemble, get all their kayaks ready together and go out on a group trip. And the naturalized river environment is creating something we're calling the Canoe Cove, which will be sheltered water where you can learn to paddle. And as you get better, you can venture out. And from here, you could actually canoe the entire Toronto Islands archipelago if you wanted to. There will be informal fishing nodes, the lookouts, boardwalks, and the like. And then in terms of the park plantings, we have grove, maybe some ornamental trees. So it's going to be, I think, about 85% native species here. A glade or a meadow, hedgerows that line the park paths and create a sense of frame and enclosure, and the mixed forest where you can actually feel really immersed in nature. So this is the plan of the first piece of the park we call Promontory Park South. You see all of those elements, starting with that central lawn, number 1, which can hold about 5,000 people for a movie. This is a previous generation of the design. The lawn has now swapped its spot with number 2, which is the promontory. This is where building these parks becomes tricky. We wanted a high point, but turns out the structure of this 100-year-old dock wall couldn't handle the weight of that promontory that close to the dock wall, so it had to move away from that corner. So it moved to where number 1 is, and number 1 moved to where number 2 is, essentially. And that avoids many millions of extra dollars in dock wall reinforcement. Number 8 and number 6 are basically gravel beaches where you can do group canoe kayak activities. You see the Canoe Cove area with the multiple islands. And we've actually preserved number 7, which is an Atlas crane. It's they were the most powerful cranes that were used on the Great Lakes. They're all basically gone from the Great Lakes anyway. And this is really the only one left, and it's being preserved as a heritage piece. It won't be a functional crane anymore, but it'll be kind of an artifact in the park. I already spoke a bit about the islands. They'll be heavily vegetated. One will have a little beach area so you could canoe to it. The others will, I think, essentially be inaccessible unless you're going to kayak over to them. But here you get a sense of the kind of environment that we're going to be creating. The lower right is a rendering of the Canoe Cove. And that's the experience we want people to be able to come and have. You know, and this is like 10 minutes from our central business district. So it's amazing how close this is going to be to the financial core, and yet it's going to be a very different environment. And then the destination playground, which I spoke about, which will have its own sort of design language that's really about kids, right next to the crane, which I think is something that kids get excited about. We'll create a very unique playscape, probably unique to Canada. There's only a couple of these in North America. There's the one at Maggie Daly, which I mentioned. The other one is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They built a similar kind of destination playground. They targeted that they were going to get around 800,000 people a year. And in their first year, they had 2 million. So there's a real pent-up demand for better playgrounds that challenge kids and that are engaging for adults too. And that's what we're targeting here. This really is an overview of the river itself, again, with all of the different elements. You can see how they work together. The main river channel, the levees on either side. Behind them, you see the lake-connected wetlands. Then you see that white dashed line that says top of bank. That, again, is the extent of what the floodwaters would reach. And everything within those two lines is designed to be floodable. So we anticipate that every so often that will be completely underwater, right up to that white line. So the whole levee system, or the levee pathway system, I should say, and some of the canoe kayak launches will be inaccessible, but that landscape is being designed to withstand that so that there's not a huge amount of fix-up work to be done. If the waters are moving fast, they may rip out some plant life. But the pedestrian bridge, which is one of the few kind of obstructions in there, or the two pedestrian bridges, are going to be designed to withstand the floodwaters. And they have a minimal amount of freeboard, so they shouldn't restrict the water flow too much. And we've actually planned for how much friction they create so that we know we've got the flood conveyance capacity. But we needed the bridges because if we didn't have them, the river would only be crossable at its two far ends, and it's almost a kilometer. And it would have really isolated one side from the other, which we didn't want. So we now have a circuit that can meander through here. And we hope to really interpret what's going on in this park. Once this is grown in, it is going to look like it was here forever, which it clearly isn't. It's a completely manufactured landscape, but it's going to function exactly like a natural landscape. So I think to someone who doesn't know what was done, without us revealing it and interpreting it, no one will have any understanding that they're in something that really is a pretty amazing product of what humans can do when they take a different attitude towards things like flood protection and getting away from single purpose infrastructure and starting to overlay multiple layers such as habitat and human recreation, as well as flood protection. And they actually can all work together. And I think it's that kind of thinking that I think is going to be essential for our cities as we continue to build cities. We've got to stop building single purpose pieces of infrastructure. We don't have enough space and they don't serve enough of the population. So I'm quite proud that we've built this in this way. This could so easily have been a very different project that would have had very little impact. And if you look to the sides of the screen, to the left side in particular, you'll see we now have a whole new set of development sites that are now waterfront property that were not waterfront property before. So where you see Commissioner Street, All those boxes, that's future development that would have just been fronting onto more development on the other side of the street, but will now actually have waterfront access. So we've doubled, on Villiers Island, we've doubled the amount of waterfront property, which is almost all property owned by the city. So when this gets sold, private developers for development, the city will get a much bigger return on the value of their land than they would have in the old scheme, which would have, as I mentioned, rebuild the river in its present location underneath the highway, and would not have had the impact that this is going to have, either aesthetically or functionally as an amenity. This is the second piece of park, River Park North. This is going to have a nature play focused playground. So there'll be 2 nodes for kids. The destination play is a bit more active, a bit more play equipment structured. The nature play one will be very focused just on bringing kids into nature and having them experience things like logs and trees and other natural elements, and be more wooded. And then on the right-hand side, number 6, 7 will be picnic lawn and picnic areas where you'll be at this very dramatic bend in the river. So again, we have this kind of mix of more active recreation and passive recreation, all framed on the north by a kind of forest frame, and on the south by the wetlands. And here are some views from within that River Park North, looking south across the river and to the levees. We have to prevent scour, and the river does freeze and have ice flows in it. So there is a lot of armor stone in the points where the river takes a bend, but where it doesn't, we've actually managed to use, again, the submerged trees to reinforce the edge and create more habitat. And you'll see some photos of that in a minute. And then the River Park South, we have created a grade separated bike trail. In Toronto, we have quite a bit of conflict between pedestrians and cyclists, particularly in parks. We have like path rage, where you get angry pedestrians screaming at cyclists who are cycling through the park that they shouldn't be in there, they should be out on the road. This kind of takes a cue from Central Park and tries to create a grade separated pedestrian trail with bridges and tunnels so that you can bike through without interrupting anybody who's taking a stroll, and then connect up to our on-street bike trail that goes across Cherry Street. And here's a view looking back north from the south side. There's a levee path with the bridge where the water comes into the lake-connected wetland. And then probably the most habitat-rich piece is what we're calling the Don Greenway, which is another one of the overflows. This has a habitat island, which is meant not for humans, but just for animals. This line connects up to something called the Leslie Street Spit, which is a 4-kilometer long armature that was built to receive dredgeate from the Toronto Harbor. But nature has taken it over to the extent that it's become a wildlife refuge now. And so it's going to be decommissioned for accepting lake fill and turned over really as a habitat park that you can walk in, but it's vast, and certain areas are closed off. But it is part of what's called the North American Flyway. So all of our migratory birds that head south from Ontario tend to fly right over this spot. Lots of geese, as well as lots of monarch butterflies. We get a huge monarch butterfly migration right through here. So these protected islands become pretty important places for those critters to rest before they fly south across Lake Ontario. And while you won't be able to get onto the island, you will be able to do bird watching. There'll be outlooks where you can look in. And there you see my blue heron on the left side. This is the one spot where it might actually be quiet and private enough for a blue heron to feel safe enough to touch down. And I kayak a lot on Cape Cod, and whenever you see a great blue there, it's just like an amazing experience. And if we can bring that into the city, I think it really signals a new direction in this kind of blending of ecology and urbanism together. So I just want to show you some photos. This is not a dream project. This project is now in its 3rd year of construction, fully funded, as I showed you at the beginning. Here you see an aerial photo, and this is actually a bit outdated now, but you can see the very outlines of the river. and in the middle, a lot of mud. We're actually building a caisson wall, which is our cutoff wall, as we call it. We're putting piles right down to bedrock to build a concrete wall the whole length of the channel. But it's not like the Keating Channel, where it's a hard-edged wall. This is very far back from the river, but it prevents contamination that's in this industrial land from migrating into the river. And it also keeps the river from moving. One of the challenges with river deltas is they flip around when they aren't controlled, and that makes development very hard. And there's a lot of pressure to make this land available for development. So the river had to kind of more or less stay in one spot. So this is how we've achieved that. So it gives you a sense of the scale of the activity. The bedrock's deep here. There's only 4 caisson drillers in North America that can drill caissons deep enough to meet our bedrock. So we have 2 of those 4 caissons on our site. Well, we did. We're now finished walls, but we had 50% of North America's deep piling capability doing this river. And the caissons are pretty beefy. They're concrete with steel reinforcement. So this is a huge industrial scale operation, but it's not going to look it at the end. And there you see the caisson wall. Once the caissons have all been poured and hardened up, we then dig out, and this is digging down for the new river channel. And then we have to put down a geomembrane to keep the contaminants from ever seeping into the river so that the water stays clean. And then this is what goes on top of the geomembrane, the rock bed for the stream bed. And here you see the logs that I've talked about being used, to protect the river edge from scour and also create habitat. And then we've created a series of signature new bridges that we need because, well, we've created new islands, so it needs new bridge connections. There is a bridge that bridges the Keating Channel already, but it's too low. This one has been raised up higher so that the floodwaters won't get impeded by it. It also lets us put a public promenade that passes underneath the bridge, and you can kind of see that on the right-hand side. There's a pedestrian walkway there so that all of the park areas are contiguous and you don't have to cross the bridge roadways to get from one piece of the public park space to another. These bridges, this one's installed. There are 2 more that have gone in. They're the first couple for Commissioner Street, and we have 2 more coming. They're being the pieces, because it's a compound curved steel structure. They're being shaped at a shipyard in Amsterdam, and then the pieces are being shipped over to a boat building yard in Halifax, who is assembling them all. And then these bridges have been floated down St. Lawrence River or up the St. Lawrence River from Halifax to Toronto, and they come into the harbor on a barge, and there'll be a couple more coming. So we post the footage of these things, making their way along the waterway. We're hoping the next one will arrive before the seaway closes, which would be sometime in November. The seaway has to close due to ice sooner. Then we won't see the next one till next year. But so as I said, we're about 3 years into construction. In 2 more years, the river will be flowing through its new channel. And a year after that, this will all open up to the public. So 2024, this park system will be online. And that's it. I probably used up more time than I was supposed to, but it's a tough project to talk about in 25 minutes. And thank you very much for having me. It's been my pleasure, and I hope people enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.